Welcome to Open Secrets Radio, a podcast about power and profit in pursuit of truth and justice. I'm your host, Nolwazi Nene.
It's only very recently that we're coming to understand the extent to which personal data is being treated like a raw material for these private tech companies. And this is why it's so important for us to interrogate the risks that comes with the digital welfare state.
Today we have Open Secrets investigators Abby May, Zen Mathe, and Michael Marchant giving us an overview of the recently published three-part article series on the potential profiteers of a universal basic income grant payment system. Mike, Zen, and Abby, thank you for joining us today. So, what is the UBIG and why is it important?
So the UBIG, which stands for the Universal Basic Income Grant, or alternatively the Universal Basic Income Guarantee, is a form of social protection, a social grant, which in its truest sense, as the name suggests, would be universal. And so many advocates for a universal basic income grant or guarantee around the world say that it is a grant pegged at a certain level, usually at a poverty line, that would go to everyone in a country. So anyone would be eligible to receive it. In South Africa, the discussions around the UBIG have been a bit more varied. Some have argued for a more gradual implementation. So, for example, could it go to adults between the years of 18 and 59 who are currently unemployed but not covered by either child grants or old age grants? And we already have a form of this in the form of the Social Relief of Distress Grant, which is the 370 rand a month that goes to unemployed adults and was introduced during COVID-19. But the UBIG would be expanding that, extending it. Why it's so important? I mean, South Africa, we have a constitutional guarantee to progressively realize our right to social protection. And so I think many advocates of UBIG have said that if government really wants to fulfill that constitutional right, it needs to do this. But also in global experience shows that a UBIG can be one of the most powerful tools in a state's range of policy options to address poverty, to reduce inequality. I think Nolwazi, the one thing I would add is that, when we hear the word social grant, we think, I think often very much of just plugging the gaps, so making sure that someone has the absolute essential to survive. And that's one of the things that a universal basic income guarantee could provide. But, lots of organizations have shown, and experience around the world shows, that it's not just about that, but it's also about enabling people to take advantage of opportunities and to participate in the economy in a broader sense.
In 2021, Open Secrets published Digital Profiteers, Who Profits Next from Social Grants. And that was another report led by Abby, Michael, and Zen on the digitization of grants, with a particular focus on the Social Relief of Distress grant. Abby, what insights has that investigation provided about the possible implementation of a basic income grant in South Africa?
So our digital profiteers investigation primarily focused on some of the companies that were essentially digitalizing what was at the time the new SRD grant, the 350 Rand grant, that came about in a time of crisis during the COVID-19 pandemic. And really, it was the government's response following a large call from civil society and the public for a need for some sort of government assistance for those individuals between the ages of 18 and 59 who weren't receiving any other social grant or weren't a part of the unemployment scheme within the country or weren't receiving any other form of assistance from the government either, and were just completely left without any sort of assistance during the pandemic. And so what came about from that was the SRD grant. And because it was a time of pandemic and we needed to social distance, the government, particularly the Department of Social Development and SASSA, decided that those application processes would have to take place primarily online. But that also kind of fell in line with this large long-term plan from the Department of Social Development and SASSA for the entire South African grant system to be to be digitalized. And so what we see actually is with the introduction of the SRD grant, basically that process starting as well. A lot of the physical cash payment points now moving onto online systems, grant recipients being encouraged to open bank accounts rather than receiving their payments in person and things of that nature. And essentially that investigation focused on one particular company called GovChat that was offering its services completely for free to the state. And it was quite bizarre because the other service providers were not providing their services for free. And so in that investigation, we were generally questioning, you know, what is the incentive for a company to offer services of this nature, very large scale, but also quite complex, completely and entirely for free to the state while others haven't. And I think how that's informed our current series on the Universal Basic Income Grant is this idea that throughout the campaigning of a potential UBI in South Africa, there's generally been a lack of focus on the actual payment system itself and what that would look like.
Zen, why do you think the UBIG was such a big ticket item in the 2024 national elections in South Africa? And what do you think this means for the new government of national unity?
I think the universal basic income grant should have actually been a bigger ticket item across the board, at least across the major political parties. But what we instead see is a mixed response when it comes to political parties and their stance on social welfare and social grants, and specifically the UBIG. The ANC's manifesto professes to increase the SRD grant with the intention to expand this to become a basic income grant over time. And the DA's manifesto, on the other hand, claims that it will increase the SRD grant so that over time it becomes a basic income grant, but also elsewhere says it wants to investigate a basic income grant to determine whether it is affordable and viable. And then on the other hand, the Freedom Front Plus's manifesto states that the masses have to rely on social grants but do not outright commit to provide the grant, and elsewhere have described them as unaffordable. And many of these manifesto claims are vague, and the party's public comments usually go no further than a commitment to consider a basic income grant. Even where the positions are more concrete, none of the political parties go into detail regarding how they will fund these grants, nor provide any response to National Treasury's apparent reluctance to increase the grant. As it was spoken about earlier, there's this contestation around the 370 SRD grant, and the grant actually only increased by 20 Rand in April of this year in 2024 for the first time in 4 years, which already shows a huge lagging behind inflation, largely because National Treasury insisted that it was unaffordable. Recently, in the State of the Nation address, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced the extension of the SRD grant and noted that this is with the intention to continue to work towards the introduction of a basic income grant, but doesn't make any mention of concrete timelines or, again, the plans of how this would be rolled out. So I guess it remains to be seen what comes forward from the GNU with regards to this. But I think what is clear is that the future implementation of a UBIG in South Africa will be complex and require a reconciliation of contested opinions.
Who are the big corporations that stand to profit from the implementation of a UBIG?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting because like publicly it appears that there's like this general stance like from the business sector or the corporate sector in South Africa. There's a general stance that a UBIG isn't going to work or benefit them in any way. But I think the work that Open Secrets has been doing on this for quite some time generally shows that there are substantial amounts of profits to be made through the grant system. Sadly, it's not as clear to many of us to what extent that looks like, but it is also quite clear which players at the moment are certainly trying to kind of stake their bets on it. In the series, we kind of highlight this idea that the political parties, like they didn't mention ways in which they're actually going to kind of like fund any of this, like any of their stances on the grants. But it's also been particularly clear that, National Treasury, who does the budget allocations for the state, has been against not only increasing the SRD grants. I think that's why it took 4 years for it to go from 350 to 370, but then also increasing other grants as well, which has been a general pattern of like minimal amounts. And that's because the National Treasury stance has been, that we can't, South Africa cannot afford it. But it's also interesting because in our series, we also kind of highlight this strange dynamic where National Treasury says that we can't afford a UBIG and generally increasing the SRD grant as well. But at the same time, it's also really important that our grant system is linked to making sure that people are banked and banking. And that's why we need to kind of like move away from like a physical system and move to this online digitalized system. And they've kind of been spearheading that kind of agenda. And what we've seen is that from that, the fact that SASA and the Department of Social Development are digitalizing the grant system, what we've seen is that there have been companies, particularly from the fintech sector, that have kind of placed themselves in the forefront of figuring out how and when to get into the social grants pie. So in the series, we mention the likes of Time Bank, who have not only kind of offered what they say very low interest banking options for grant recipients, but have specifically created a financial product that caters towards every grant recipient besides those who receive the SRD grant to access their grant earlier, meaning they'll get a portion of the money sooner from when the actual payment date would happen. And when the payment date does happen, then Time Bank would just deduct whatever the fees were that was given ahead of time. So you see those kind of financial products happening. And again, there's this question of whether that in itself kind of creates indebtedness as well. But then you also have other players that, you wouldn't think would get into financial technology and financial services, but are so intimately tied to social grants as well. So you have the likes of ShopRite, which Christo Visa is still famously a big owner of. And the ShopRite has been offering money and financial service options for grant recipients as well and to the general public. But it's quite interesting because ShopRite is also the site where almost every grant recipient can say that they have at least once gone to collect their grants or get their grants, and then from there do their shopping. The same with the likes of the Boxes, you have the Pep stores, the Checkers. All these retailers are kind of shifting into this financial service product line that they're providing their customers. And it's really benefiting them because at the same time, many grant recipients go to do their shopping at these places and collect their grants. And we can't say for sure right now how much they're profiting from that, but it's so clear to see that there is so much money to be made from it.
In the article series, we see the term financial inclusion. Could you give us a brief overview of what financial inclusion is and just tell us a bit about how it fits into the UBIG puzzle?
The term financial inclusion can mean many different things in different contexts, but I think when it comes to UBIG and the conversation around financial inclusion, I think it really speaks to, again, to the heart of the definition of what a universal basic income grant would be and is, and in the context of South Africa, what that might look like. And I think it's essentially affording the right to all individuals to participate in the economy, not to be excluded. And I think a truly universal basic income grant would be granted to all without, requiring any work or activity or a means test. So there would be no exclusionary criteria that determines whether or not you're able to qualify to access the grant. So ultimately, it would be the state making that payment to all individuals in the country, irrespective of an individual's status or situation or employment. Amandla.Moby, who we interviewed in some of the series as we're putting this together, described it was to say that it ensures dignity and well-being for all people in the country, irrespective of whether you're employed or unemployed. And I think a good way to kind of talk about how the financial inclusion element in UBIG is important. It would provide a base floor below which no one in the country would slip. And I think that is to say that we should be striving towards enabling everybody in the country to at least have their constitutionally enshrined human rights and dignities met. I think the corporate companies definitely do not ever have the human-centered element in the way that they do business, of course. So when they're talking financial inclusion, it's definitely with prioritizing profit. And so when you're talking about, as Abby mentioned, banking the unbankable, there's insidious ways in which you're targeting lower income people. And the way in which you're doing that is, I think, how we highlight the fact that as much as we're moving into a tech space where corporations are moving into the grant system, trying to offer the solution in the space and using the excuse that the public administration of the payments of grant system hasn't been good, we say take heed when private sector is viewed as the answer, because we've seen from our experience with Net1 and CPS that that is not always the case.
In part 3 of the UBIG series, you use an example from Brazil to talk about a basic income grant system that has worked. Mike, can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I think that just before speaking about the Brazilian example specifically, I think it's worth pointing out that one of the big gaps in the payment system at the moment is the exclusion of grant recipients themselves from decision making on that system. And so there's an ongoing, I think, battle and struggle in the sector of grant recipients, for example, still wanting pay points, cash pay points to be opened, while SASSA are progressively shutting them down because of the cost and risk associated with them. But this point has been made by the Black Sash very powerfully, which is that, if you want the social grant system to be constitutionally compliant and as inclusive as possible, you need to ask grant recipients what works for them. And I think that needs to be central to any kind of solutions around the payment system. In terms of the Brazilian example, the reason that we spoke about it is that, we think it offers an interesting alternative perspective to a lot of the dominant narratives that fintech companies and banks have made around financial inclusion. And so in one of the cities near Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, they introduced a basic income guarantee about 10 years ago now. And Brazil is one of the countries in the world with the most progressive realization of what is there also a constitutional guarantee of a basic income grant. So in this city, around a third of the population, or nearly a third, now receives around $40 per month as a basic income guarantee. But what is so interesting is that from 2018, those grants have been payable via a digital currency, and they've been payable to individuals via their phones, via an app, or via a prepaid card. And now that model sounds a lot like some of the models that we've presented as risks that have come forward from various fintech companies. And the distinguishing feature of the Brazil case is that the entire operation is run by a community-owned bank at a municipal level. It is not driven by the interests of shareholders, and it does not have a profit incentive. And so what they found in Brazil is that it's been a radically different experience. So for example, grant recipients find that the bank in that case is not selling on their data to subsidiaries. They are not constantly being sold products by subsidiaries, or even without their consent given financial products, as was the case with Net1 and CPS in South Africa. And also any excess, surplus, or profit that is made from the system via various transactions ultimately finds its way back to the state via the municipality and can further support the system. It's not being paid out as dividends to shareholders. The reason we think this is such an interesting model to look at is that it appears, certainly on the surface, to marry some of the great benefits that come from financial technology while protecting against the risks that come from investor-led fintech, which, as Abby and Zen have spoken about in their answers, has the risk of being inherently exploitative and extractive because shareholder interests are at the forefront rather than the interests of the system itself. Now, it's always difficult to look at different contexts and say, let's just do what they've done here. But I think that it introduces at least the beginnings of a very interesting conversation in South Africa about how to ensure that we can make use of the technology that's available that makes it safer in many instances and cuts down costs for many grant recipients, but tries to inoculate the system from some of the risks.
You mentioned Black Sash. Abby, could you tell us a bit more about some of the other organizations who've been speaking up about the issue and how we can support the campaign for a basic income grant?
So at the moment, there is a South African Universal Basic Income Coalition that is comprised of a variety of activists and civil society organizations in South Africa that have been and are currently consistently campaigning for a universal basic income in South Africa. And some of the organizations in that coalition include the Black Sash. It also includes some of the organizations that we interviewed for our series, which is the Institute of Economic Justice. They've consistently released a variety of papers, but also recently fact sheets that explain not only what a UBI is, but how exactly South Africa can economically afford to do it. So that's really interesting work that they're doing. Then we also have hashtag Pay the Grants, which has been possibly like the largest ground roots movement at the moment that have been campaigning for UBI, but also consistently campaigning for the entire social grant system to be working in favor, as Mike says, for grant recipients. And then there are other organizations like Amandla.mobi. You can also find them. All of these organizations, you can find them on social media. Amandla.mobi has been doing some incredibly interesting campaigning as well around UBI, but at the same time, they've also been campaigning towards taxing the wealthiest individuals in the country, since South Africa still doesn't have a wealth tax. And that's really interesting because it kind of ties into how we can possibly fund a UBI. And there's plenty of others as well. The Social Policy Initiative, Youth Lab, composers of young individuals who are also actively campaigning for UBI and increasing social grants to individuals who are unemployed and don't necessarily qualify for a child grant or a disability grant and things of that nature. Women on Farms as well. You can also follow them on social media. Really powerful intersectional lens that they bring to the discussion. And of course, Open Secrets. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to Open Secrets Radio. If you'd like to read the UBIG series, go to opensecrets.org.za/UBIG, so UBIG. And if you think our work is important, consider becoming an Open Secrets supporter. For as little as 50 Rand a month, you can help us continue holding the powerful accountable. Donate now at opensecrets.org.za/support. See you next time.